The convoy appeared at dawn on January 28, 2025, 47 buses carrying 2,847 migrants toward the Mexican border under federal escort. Within hours, which should have been a routine deportation operation, would ignite the most explosive immigration debate since Trump's return to office, forcing Americans to choose between competing visions of national sovereignty, human dignity, and the fundamental meaning of justice itself. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was live streaming from her congressional office when the first images began circulating on social media platforms nationwide. Families separated at processing centers, children crying as parents were loaded onto different buses. Elderly migrants collapsed from exhaustion during the 12-hour journey to deportation facilities. Her response would be swift, emotional, and politically devastating to administration claims that the border crisis had been permanently solved. But Candace Owens was already preparing her own comprehensive analysis of the same deportation operation, one that would completely reframe what Americans were seeing and forced every citizen to confront deeply uncomfortable truths about immigration, law enforcement, and national survival in the modern interconnected world environment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not just immigration policy, but the very soul of American democracy itself. The mass deportation program had been Trump's signature campaign promise since announcing his 2024 presidential run. Operation Sovereign Shield, as it was officially designated by the Department of Homeland Security, represented the most comprehensive immigration enforcement initiative in American history. The statistical scope was staggering. Over 11 million undocumented immigrants identified for potential removal, 50,000 ICE agents deployed nationwide, and coordinated partnerships with local law enforcement agencies in all 50 states. The operation's carefully planned first phase had targeted individuals with documented criminal records, gang affiliations, and outstanding federal warrants. Public support remained relatively strong as news reports focused on MS-13 members, drug traffickers, and repeat violent offenders being systematically removed from American communities. But Phase 2, launched in late January 2025, expanded the scope to include virtually anyone without legal documentation, regardless of their personal circumstances or deep community ties. This dramatic expansion transformed what had been primarily a law enforcement operation into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. The buses departing that January morning carried not just criminals, but also small business owners who had paid federal taxes for decades, honor students whose only crime was being brought to America as infants, and families whose American-born children were now being tragically separated from their undocumented parents. For AOC, the images from that morning represented everything she had warned about during months of congressional debates over immigration reform. Her live stream, which would reach over 12 million viewers in its first 6 hours, captured the raw emotional intensity that would define the progressive response to Trump's deportation policies for years to come. She spoke directly to the camera from her congressional office, with printed photographs of separated families strategically spread across her desk. These weren't abstract policy discussions or statistical analyses, she argued with visible passion. These were real human beings whose lives were being systematically destroyed by a government system that prioritized bureaucratic paperwork over people, rigid legalism over love, and narrow nationalism over basic human compassion and dignity. The statistical data she presented painted a devastating picture of the deportation program's mounting human cost. Children separated from parents had increased suicide attempt rates by over 400%, according to mental health professionals. Emergency room visits for anxiety and depression in immigrant communities had tripled since enforcement began. School attendance in predominantly Latino districts had plummeted dramatically as entire families went into hiding or fled to sanctuary cities across the country. But what made her argument particularly powerful was how she connected current deportations to broader patterns of American injustice. The same legal frameworks being used to justify family separations had once been used to justify slavery, Japanese internment, and Native American removal. The language of law and order had always been deployed to mask systematic cruelty toward vulnerable populations. Her proposed solution was comprehensive and politically bold for the Democratic Party: immediate cessation of family separations regardless of immigration status, a pathway to citizenship for anyone who had been in the country for more than 5 years, massive investment in immigration courts to process cases humanely rather than through mass deportation. Most importantly, recognition that America's immigration system was fundamentally broken and required complete reconstruction. Candace Owens had been monitoring the progressive response to Operation Sovereign Shield with the keen strategic awareness that had made her one of the most effective and influential voices in conservative media. She recognized both the significant political opportunity and the fundamental misunderstanding of American sovereignty that AOC's increasingly emotional public appeal represented to voters. Her response came in the form of a comprehensive multimedia analysis that would be strategically viewed over 8 million times across multiple digital platforms. She didn't attempt to dispute the raw human cost of deportations or ignore the genuinely emotional impact of family separations. Instead, she systematically recontextualized what those costs actually meant for American democracy, rule of law, and long-term national survival in the modern interconnected world environment. The previous approach to immigration enforcement had created the exact humanitarian crisis that progressive politicians now blamed entirely on Trump's policies. Years of selective enforcement, sanctuary city policies, and political rhetoric actively encouraging illegal border crossings created a massive population of vulnerable people living in perpetual legal limbo. The real cruelty was allowing this untenable situation to persist indefinitely rather than resolving it decisively through comprehensive enforcement. Every family separated during deportations was a family that had been living under constant threat of separation for years. Every child traumatized by enforcement actions was a child whose parents had knowingly placed them in an impossible situation by violating immigration law. The humanitarian crisis wasn't being caused by enforcement, it was being revealed by enforcement. Her argument went deeper than immigration policy criticism. American sovereignty itself was at stake in the immigration debate. If the United States couldn't control who entered its territory, lived in its communities, and accessed its resources, then it wasn't truly a sovereign nation. The compassionate response to global poverty and violence wasn't to ignore immigration law, it was to create legal pathways for immigration while maintaining clear boundaries. The moral framework that AOC was promoting, Owens argued, would ultimately harm the very people it claimed to protect. Unlimited compassion without legal boundaries created incentives for dangerous border crossings, human trafficking, and exploitation of vulnerable migrants by criminal organizations. The most humane immigration system was one that was clear, consistent, and firmly enforced. The philosophical divide between their positions was dramatically exposed when both women testified before the House Judiciary Committee's emergency hearing on immigration enforcement. The hearing became a nationally televised examination of American identity, moral obligation, and democratic governance. AOC arrived with testimony that was both deeply personal and systematically comprehensive. She had spent the previous week visiting detention facilities, interviewing separated families, and documenting the psychological impact of enforcement actions on immigrant communities. Her approach emphasized the human faces behind immigration statistics and moral obligations that transcended legal technicalities. She presented case studies that made abstract policy debates concrete and personal. Maria Santos, a hotel housekeeper who had paid taxes for 15 years and whose American-born daughter was now in foster care while Maria awaited deportation. Carlos Rodriguez, a construction worker who had started a small business employing 12 people and whose removal would eliminate jobs for American citizens. Her policy recommendations were detailed and constitutionally grounded. Immediate implementation of family case management, rather than detention for asylum seekers. Expansion of immigration court capacity to reduce backlogs. Creation of regional processing centers that could handle asylum claims efficiently without requiring dangerous border crossings. Most importantly, recognition that immigration enforcement should serve human dignity rather than treating people as problems to be eliminated. Owens approached the same hearing from a fundamentally different moral and political framework. Her testimony focused on what she characterized as the progressive movement's systematic undermining of American sovereignty through emotional manipulation that ignored legal reality and democratic accountability. The problem with AOC's approach, she argued, wasn't lack of compassion, but failure to recognize that sustainable compassion required sustainable systems. The United States couldn't help vulnerable people around the world if it couldn't maintain control over its own territory, resources, and legal frameworks. Unlimited immigration might feel morally superior, but it would ultimately destroy the American systems that made the country attractive to migrants. Her documentation included extensive research on the economic and social impacts of illegal immigration on American communities. Public school systems in border states were overwhelmed by students whose educational needs exceeded available resources. Hospital emergency rooms were providing expensive medical care that couldn't be billed to patients without legal status. Housing costs in immigrant-heavy communities were rising as increased demand outpaced supply. The family separated during deportations, she argued with characteristic directness and conviction, were experiencing consequences that their parents had risked when they chose to violate immigration law. American children were separated from parents every day when those parents were arrested for crimes. Immigration violations were crimes, and consequences for criminal behavior inevitably affected families. But she also proposed solutions that surprised observers on both sides. Rather than opposing all immigration, she called for massive expansion of legal immigration pathways that would make illegal immigration unnecessary. Work visa programs that could absorb economic migrants legally, refugee resettlement systems that could process asylum claims in origin countries rather than requiring dangerous journeys to American borders. The hearing revealed fundamental disagreements about American identity, moral obligation, and democratic governance that went beyond specific immigration policies. AOC believed America's moral leadership required prioritizing human rights over legal technicalities. Owens argued that America's moral leadership required maintaining the rule of law that made American prosperity and freedom possible. As immediate controversy over specific deportation operations faded from daily news coverage, longer-term patterns began emerging that complicated both women's narratives. The Trump administration's enforcement policies had indeed reduced illegal border crossings significantly, as Owens had predicted, but they had also created humanitarian crises in detention facilities and immigrant communities, as AOC had warned. The economic impacts were similarly complex. Some American workers saw wage increases as labor supply tightened, but food prices rose as agricultural labor became more expensive. Small businesses that had relied on immigrant workers struggled to find replacement employees. Construction projects were delayed as contractors couldn't find adequate labor. Meanwhile, human costs continued accumulating. Children separated from parents during deportations showed lasting psychological trauma even when families were eventually reunited. Immigrant communities that had been integrated into American society for decades were disrupted as longtime residents were removed. Both women found themselves gradually adjusting their public positions as real-world evidence continued accumulating over subsequent months. AOC began publicly acknowledging that some immigration enforcement was necessary and that unlimited immigration could strain community resources beyond their capacity. Owens started recognizing that purely enforcement-focused approaches created legitimate humanitarian problems that required more comprehensive solutions than deportation alone could provide. But these nuanced position adjustments received little attention in a media environment that continued to frame immigration as a simple choice between compassion and security. The border debate had become another contentious front in America's ongoing culture wars, with each side using immigration policy to advance broader ideological narratives about American identity, values, and global responsibilities. The ultimate outcome was that neither side achieved their originally stated policy objectives. Mass deportations didn't eliminate America's complex immigration challenges, but shifted them to different locations and communities across the country. Humanitarian advocacy didn't prevent enforcement actions, but may have influenced how those actions were conducted and implemented by federal agencies. The war over America's borders had revealed how dramatically unprepared the country's democratic institutions were for governing immigration in an era of global displacement, economic interdependence, and instant communication that could mobilize political opposition. The questions that AOC and Owens had raised about sovereignty, compassion, and democratic governance would continue defining American political debates for decades to come, but the fundamental answers remained as elusive as the separated families still affected by policies that neither